Hello and welcome to the Marketing Times Analytics Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Safranis, and today we're on with Laura Boman. Laura, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, first, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me to join your podcast. I'm really excited to talk with you about marketing research. So, yes, my name's Laura Bowman. I have a PhD in business administration with a concentration in marketing from the University of Central Florida. And I would say that my research focuses on two main areas. The first being food related marketing, which is pretty broad. And the second area that I am focusing on is pro-social behavior, which also is a pretty broad area of consumer behavior.
Let's dive into those two areas. Tell us about your research.
To just start out with some of the food research, I've had some publications in the last couple of years that are related to, for example, how we taste our food. So, one of my favorite papers that I've worked on so far is actually about how the lighting of the room that we're in affects how the food that we eat tastes. There's been some previous research that says that the color of the plate or the color of the cup that you're eating and drinking from, that those can affect how your food tastes. So we wanted to look at some other kind of atmospheric conditions that may affect the flavor of your food as well. So one thing that we considered was the lighting. What we found was actually that if you eat in dimmer lighting, your food is more flavorful to you. So if you notice when you go to the movie theater and you're eating that salty popcorn, you're probably gonna eat a little bit more because the flavor of it is stronger in that dark room compared to in a brightly lit room. Just recently, I have worked on a project that's about eco labels. Within consumer packaged goods, there's a lot of different kinds of labeling now, whether something is organic, whether it's natural, non GMO. There's a lot of different kinds of labels out there. Some of them have some specific rules attached to when they can be used. So, if, for example, you're wanting to eat grass fed beef, there's only certain packages that are going to say grass fed beef on them because the USDA actually regulates things like that for some labeling. Now, we wanted to look at a label that wasn't necessarily regulated. So, any company doing a consumer packaged goods could put eco friendly. It could be that the packaging is eco friendly. It could be that the way the food is grown is eco friendly. So, we wanted to look though at what consumers perceive when they see that eco friendly label on a consumer packaged good. So if you think about things like boxed pasta or a can of pumpkin or maybe a bag of cookies, those are what I mean by consumer packaged goods. And so we looked at the difference in having that can of pumpkin with no label on it versus a can of pumpkin that had the eco label. And otherwise, these two cans are identical. The only difference is adding a label that says eco friendly. And we found some really interesting results. So, what we found was that if you put that little label, which was relatively small on the can, if you put that label on there, people actually think that the food is healthier. And because it's healthier, they think it tastes better and they're more likely to purchase it. And what I find most interesting about that is that usually we have an association with healthy food that makes us think that it's not going to taste as good. So if you think about a plain potato versus a potato chip, most people have the association with unhealthy food tastes good. That's why we eat at fast food restaurants and we eat those ultra processed foods because we have this intuition that those things taste better. But that labeling seems to turn that whole dynamic around and make us actually think that healthy food tastes better to us.
So, what are some applications of these food related studies?
I almost feel a little bit guilty about that particular study because I like to think of things that are gonna positively impact consumers, that right now there's a push in my field to benefit consumers' well-being. So making ways that we can make smarter choices as consumers, for example. What I found though in that study was showing that just adding that eco label, which is not regulated, that any consumer packaged good company can actually put that label on their food and it tricks our minds. So these companies can use that eco label to encourage more sales. which is great for the companies, but it's not necessarily great for the consumers.
That's really interesting. How was the study funded?
That particular study was self-funded. So I have two co-authors, one at the UNC Greensboro and one at Murray State University. And between the three of us, we actually just split the cost. We completed that study with online participants on a platform called Cloud Connect. And what that does is it crowdsources the data. You put together a study. I'm an experimentalist. So when I do a study, it's going to have maybe one, two, three, four different options. On these kind of platforms, the participants are all over the United States. They're 18 years or older. And they're people who just take surveys for a small amount of money. And that's generally considered a good way of getting generalizable research because the age ranges are all over. There's a mix of different genders. And we just pay participants to take these studies over platforms like that.
Okay. And what was the other area of your research? Could you dive into that?
Of course. My other area of research is in pro social behavior. I think when most people think about pro social behavior, they think about donation behavior. And that is a large part of it. But I feel like pro social kind of goes beyond that. There's other behaviors that I think of, like helping behaviors. If you're volunteering, for example, that's a pro social behavior. One that I've been really interested in the last couple of years, and I think in general, consumers are interested in this too, is tipping behavior. So nowadays, it seems every type of business that you go to asks you for a tip. So if you go to a coffee shop, before you get your order, they flip around that iPad and they ask you for a tip. If you go and have your dog boarded, they ask you for a tip. And it's happened since the pandemic, and people have mixed feelings about it. So I think right at the beginning of the pandemic, people were more inclined to provide tips in those more unusual circumstances, but now they've become reactant against those kind of things. I think a lot of times you get irritated when you get asked for a tip, especially multiple times a day. But from the business and the employee perspective, it's actually really helpful to encourage tipping behavior. Tipping is only helping the employee. As if I were a barista at a local coffee shop, of course, if people come in and they tip, I'm going to be a lot happier, right? I'm going to go home with more in my pocket, more than just my regular paycheck. But the great thing for the businesses is that if the employees are happier, they'll stay longer. They don't have as much turnover with employees. They don't have to go through the hiring process. They don't have to do all of the training for new employees. So it's actually beneficial to both the employee and the employer to encourage tipping from consumers. One of the ways that I have found, along with my co authors, is that if you put in the POS system, the point of sale system, when you're asking for the tip, if you put a little smiley face and the smiley face gets larger as the tip amount gets larger, people will actually tip more. What we found was that on average, people would tip 11% more if you included an emoji compared to just the dollar amount.
And do you know if this is being used, this research?
Yes. So there's a few different places that I know of that are doing the emojis now. I work with a local coffee shop. I live in Georgia, near Macon, Georgia, and I shared this research with the marketing manager at that coffee shop. And so she's implemented it into there. But we actually completed one of these studies at a restaurant slash bar in Cocoa, Florida. And because we did the study in their restaurant, they have actually implemented it as well.
So what do you think is the reason behind why putting emojis in the tipping options works better?
So we tested this and it was really interesting because we asked people to talk about their feelings when they saw the emoji versus the emoji conditions. And what we found was that people have more positive emotions when they see the emojis. There's previous research that says that emotions are contagious. So if I'm around someone who's really happy and outgoing, then it's going to make me a happier person. If I'm around somebody who's depressed and complains a lot, then I'm probably going to follow suit as well. So it's really interesting that emojis, which have already been shown to be processed in the same way as a real smile, like a real human face, they can actually help us to catch emotions. So by putting those positive faces on the check amounts, we can actually increase people's tips because they feel those positive emotions.
That's interesting. Is there any other areas you'd like to test next along a similar path of this test around tipping?
Yeah, I've got several projects that are related to tipping. I've got some that are about how you feel after you tip, for example. How does the act of tipping itself affect our subsequent feelings, our subsequent behaviors? And maybe how does that actually affect how we feel about what we ordered? Because it comes back to how food tastes to us actually determines a lot, right? So if something tastes really good, you're probably going to consume more of it. So one of the things that I'm looking at right now is if you tipped versus you didn't tip in one of these pre-service tipping situations, similar to a coffee shop or if you order takeout, you actually tip before you consume your food. And so I've looked at how does the act of tipping affect how you then anticipate the food to taste? It's really interesting. Even when people haven't consumed the food yet, they think that the food tastes better just because they tipped for it.
That's
So,
interesting.
yeah, I feel like if consumers know that, they may want to tip these employees so that they have better tasting food.
What do you think is the reason behind that?
I think that in our minds, we want to feel like we're being consistent, right? I tipped, so this food is going to taste good. There's something called cognitive dissonance that is if behave in a way that doesn't fit with me. So if I went out, this isn't something I would normally do, but if I went out and I bought a brand new, expensive luxury vehicle, I would feel this pull inside of me because I would say, that's not me. I'm not behaving in a way that's me. And so then our brains think of a way to reduce that pull. So we may justify our reasoning. And I may say, I needed that luxury car because I have a very long commute and I need to be comfortable and I need to be safe. And so you find ways to justify things in your mind. And I think that what we're doing when we tip, even though maybe by being asked we were cranky about it and irritated, if we went ahead and went through with it and we tipped, in order to justify that activity, then I think we actually trick our minds into thinking that the food is gonna taste better, to release that pressure of the pull between what I wanted to do and what I actually did.
Are there any applications to a totally different scenario, maybe unrelated to food, that this research can point to?
Right now, there's not a lot of research that follows up on our behavior. Even though we know that we do a lot of things sequentially, right? First, I do this, then I do that. Think that probably a contribution of that research would be that we can look at the behaviors that are seem like they might not be related to the initial action that we take, but in fact, we can predict people's perceptions or subsequent behaviors based off of their first action. So I think you could take that in several different ways. So, how does, for example, if you take really good care of something, you're at an Airbnb and you maybe make sure that you check off all of the cleaning lists before you leave versus you don't really pay that much attention to the cleaning list. Like, what is that going to do to how I felt about the Airbnb? Or maybe my next decision about an Airbnb, would I perhaps rent a different place based on my own actions?
That's interesting. So yeah, this is mainly consumer behavior and it doesn't have a lot of impact maybe on the business to business world where there's no tipping really. I guess there could be a little bit of a line drawn with paying a little bit more for a service and then being more likely to enjoy it. Would you say that might be something worth exploring?
Oh, yeah, I think that would definitely be a really interesting area to explore. My area of research is basically all within consumer behavior. So that's the way that my mind thinks. I come up a lot with a lot of my research ideas based on my own life and the things that I observe and the activities that I do. But I know there's a whole nother area of research based on B2B. And there's lots and lots of researchers who look at those kind of relationships and the things that can affect them. So it would be really interesting to maybe work with someone who is more in that space and to take these basically psychology principles and see how they work in a B2B relationship as well.
That's interesting. Do you have any other research related to food that you can share?
I've got an upcoming project that I think is going to be really interesting. I have not conducted the first study. So right now we're just in the idea phase. I've had to order a lot of products to try to prepare for our first study. This is going to be a live study with live participants actually eating, and those take a lot of preparation to do. But we're going to look at the way that different scents in a room can actually affect your consumption. So there's a lot of different dimensions of scent. One can be the temperature of a scent. So if you think about eucalyptus, that's generally thought of as a cooler scent, whereas maybe a vanilla would be more of a warm scented smell. And one of the dimensions that has really not been explored that much in consumer behavior research is whether a scent is heavy versus light. So I would say examples of a heavy scent would again be maybe like a cinnamon or vanilla, and a light scent would be something like a citrus. And so what I hypothesize is that those different kinds of scents actually affect how much we're going to eat. So, what I'm preparing to do is to put participants in separate rooms where I diffuse scents. One room has a heavy scent, one room has a light scent. And then I'm actually going to provide them some food, let them watch a video, not tell them, but then I'm going to look at how much they're consuming of this food. So I've gotten a few different kinds of food products for them to test potato chips, cookies, things, M&Ms. But I think that what we're going to find probably is that there's some physiological changes that occur based on the ambient scent of the room that you're in. And that ambient scent then, because it's affecting your internal temperature, or at least fooling your body into thinking that the internal temperature has changed, that we're going to see some differences in people's consumption. What I have a gut feeling is going to happen is that the heavier scented room will actually make people eat less than the light scented room. Because you think if you're weighted down, you may not feel the desire to fill up on. Whereas the lighter scented rooms, you may feel a little bit more airy, you've got more room to snack.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's a very interesting idea. I'm curious, where do you read consumer research? Do you subscribe to any publications? Is there anything you'd recommend if, for instance, I wanted to learn more about consumer behavior, where I should go?
Of course. So we have a long list of academic journals. They use a lot of pretty heavy jargon that's from academia. But if you read between the lines, I think you can get the gist of what most of the studies are saying. Some of those would be the Journal of Consumer Research, the Journal of Marketing Research. There's psychology and marketing letters. I find that they're pretty easy to access if you just look up in Google Scholar. And if you want to find something about a specific topic, so let's say, for example, if you are interested in tipping behavior, you can just log on to Google Scholar and look up the word tipping and then do an advanced search for one of these academic journals related to marketing. Just as a word of wisdom, there are better and worse journals. And usually it's the rigor that goes into the studies that determines whether something is considered a better journal. We have rankings for them that we use within academia. But generally, if you find something in the Journal of Consumer Research, the Journal of Marketing Research, Journal of Consumer Psychology. Those are going to be really very thorough, very rigorous studies, and you can find a lot of great information there. I personally do a lot of reading within Google Scholar. I try to find topics that I'm most interested in. The journals themselves, they publish in a really wide range. So you can find things about decision sciences, or you can find things about tipping behavior or nonprofit behavior or B2B. There's a lot, all these different things going on per journal. So what I do rather than taking the physical copies is I find particular articles that are something that I'm interested in.
Let's see. Is there any other consumer research, maybe not even done by you, but that you've read and that you find particularly interesting around consumer behavior?
Actually, I did want to share with you one more of the
Sure.
papers that I've recently published. It's about what I think is a really super interesting topic that isn't talked about enough. So, have you ever heard of the word Schadenfreude?
No.
All right, it's a German word that means joy in others' misery. And if you really think about it, it's an emotion that we all feel quite often, more than we should admit to, probably. If you have a favorite sports team, for example, I'm a big Auburn fan because that's my hometown and where I got my undergraduate degree. Anything that happens that's negative to the University of Alabama is like the best thing ever to me, right? So they didn't have a super great year this year. They still had a better year than Auburn, but their year wasn't as good as it was in the Nick Saban years. So that makes me feel Schadenfreude. Several years ago, if you think back to about 2012, do you remember the ice bucket challenge?
Yeah.
All right. My dad passed away from ALS around that same time. And so when the ice bucket challenge happened, I was personally interested. My curiosity was piqued because I thought, why in the world is this phenomenon happening that people are so interested in ALS all of a sudden? Only one in 100,000 people get ALS. So it wasn't really a disease that people talked about prior to the ice bucket challenge. So I looked at that as a research question. And when I started my PhD in the fall of 2024, I started looking into it. I started conducting studies with my advisor, Dr. Yael Zemak-Ruger at the University of Central Florida. And we had an inkling that what was happening was that people enjoyed watching other people suffer, which is Schadenfreude. So we thought, okay, can you take what's usually thought of as a negative emotion, but can you take something that's usually thought of as a negative and turn it into a positive? And so what we did was we did several studies looking at how you could use what we call Schadenfreude appeals in order to increase people's donation behavior. And just this last summer, we finally were able to get that project published after almost 10 years of working on it. But it's a very robust effect. So if you think about, for example, like a pie toss or a dunking booth, all these are examples of when we use Schadenfreude to increase people's donations. And we saw enormous differences between appeals that included Schadenfreude versus appeals that did not. So if you have just a regular booth at a fair and you're asking people for donations, they're far less likely to give than if you put somebody in a dunk tank there and you say, hey, you can pay this small amount and dunk this person in the tank by throwing a ball at them. That was a really personally fulfilling project because of my backstory with ALS and how that was really a big part of why I went and got a PhD consumer behavior. And so it was really nice to see that come to fruition this last summer. And I hope that nonprofits will take that information and run with it. And part of what we do in that paper is we tell them how to structure those kind of appeals. So if you can put someone in that dunk tank or in that pie toss that people don't like, it's going to be far more successful. I think that's why at elementary schools, they always put the principal in the dunk tank because the kids want to dunk the principal, but they're very effective appeals if done correctly.
What are some maybe unusual ways that can be applied to other business types besides a dunk tank and besides maybe a nonprofit? What are some other ways that we can utilize that information?
Schadenfreude is a really interesting emotion and one that there's been a little bit of research done on it, but I think that there's a lot of room for growth. There's a lot of really great room for growth in the research about Schadenfreude itself. It's pretty underexplored, but it's such an interesting emotion and something that we feel over and over again most days. Some of the prior literature in the psychology research talks about Schadenfreude as um, part of what they call tall poppy syndrome. If you see someone who's in a higher position than you and you feel like they're in an undeserving spot. So let's say if you're at work and you have a boss who you feel maybe is more elevated in their position than they actually deserve, then you're more likely to feel schadenfreude when that person has something negative happen to them. So if, for example, they get in a car accident, as long as it's not too severe, you're more likely to feel schadenfreude about it. And that could affect, for example, your behaviors at work. But there's a lot of different ways that I think schadenfreude could affect our behaviors. I know there's been some work in the sports realm because it's very prevalent in sports. And so if you think of every kind of situation as a consumer behavior situation. So if you're attending a sporting event, for example, that is a consumer behavior situation as well, enjoying your experience. If something negative happens to a member of the team that you're playing, you're probably gonna feel schadenfreude. How does that then affect your behaviors as a consumer? Are you gonna be more indulgent, for example? Would you buy that beer and maybe a larger bag of popcorn compared to if that event didn't happen? I think that we could look at that particular emotion in a lot of different ways, and it can affect us our subsequent behaviors. Like how I talked about earlier about how one thing can then affect our behaviors later. I think that Schadenfreude is an example. If we feel that emotion, then we're quite likely to have other feelings and other expressions of that Schadenfreude.
That's very interesting. What other areas of maybe what other studies or insights have you gathered about consumer research that you can share?
Like I said, a lot of what I'm doing right now is about tipping. I've also looked at how menus can affect our tipping and our order intentions. So I work with a coffee shop in Macon, Georgia, and I'm very lucky that they allow me to run a lot of different experiments within their stores. They have several locations in the Southeast. Many of them are located in hospitals. So if you think of those little small hospital kiosks, you may be taking a study when you're at one of those and you don't even know it. But I've been able to run a lot of different studies in these coffee shops to see how we can push people's behaviors in different ways. So, one of the things that I've been looking at lately is menu design and how that affects what people order, how much they spend, and how they tip. So, if you think about a digital menu board up on the wall, and there are many different ways that you can affect people's decisions just by that menu board. So, some previous literature says that if you put the dollar signs, if you put the dollar sign on there versus you don't have the dollar sign, people will actually spend less because that dollar sign actually signals to them, hey, this is real money. And so they'll spend less money. So it's beneficial for a restaurant or a coffee shop to actually leave that little signal out of the menu. So I've been looking at things like how we order things on the menu. By order, the menu itself. So do we list things in alphabetical order? Do we do them in largest to smallest? Do we do them by most expensive to least expensive or the opposite? And I'm trying now to figure out the different ways that we could influence the people's order behavior and tipping behavior through those menu designs. They don't even know that they're being affected by it, but we can change people's behaviors with little tiny signals. So what we're looking at is like the average. So we let's say if we run a study with two different conditions. So one is emojis present, one is emojis absent. We're going to have at least 100 people, if not more like 200, doing that study. And we're going to do several iterations of that study to show that it's something that we can reproduce. Because if you run a study one time and it works the way that you expected, but you run it 5 more times and it doesn't work the way that you expected it to, then you probably don't have a robust effect. So you can't say that's something that is stable.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mhm.
I really appreciate all of this information, Laura. This is super interesting. And I love the focus on food and tipping, and then also all the other consumer behavior research that you've shared with us. So,
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed talking about my research. These are topics that I'm passionate about, and I think they affect most people. Most people are eating every day and hopefully behaving in pro social ways when they can.
yeah, awesome. Thanks again. And thanks everyone for listening. We'll talk to you soon.